Hi, Lester, Wushu Engineer. I recently uploaded the first part of my video series entitled Lightning Reflexes using Center. And since then I've monitored the interactions on this video. As I said, I was going to upload the follow-up training video if there was a significant amount of interest in the first video. Well, there was a little bit of interest, but there were a few additional subs on the video, and I also got a couple of really nice comments. So, you know, how can I refuse to do the follow-up after some nice comments like these expressing interest from viewers? So, despite the relatively low interest in this kind of content, I decided to continue and complete the follow-up video, hence me talking to you today. If you did not see the first video in the series, I strongly recommend that you watch it before watching this one, because I'm not going to discuss its content here in any real detail. Suffice to say that in that video we performed a series of tests that provided sufficient evidence to suggest that movement originating from center or lower Dantian was possible for a trained individual, and that it could be responsible for significantly improving a martial artist's reaction and response times. And I'll show you here a sample plot from one of these tests showing that the onset of Dantian engagement comes significantly before I push a button mounted on our load cell and complete a response time test. I promised in that video that the follow-up would provide broad training principles that others could incorporate into their own training regimes to develop centralized movement, this kind of centralized movement. Now, although I am a certified martial arts trainer with many years of experience teaching martial arts to people from all walks of life, I have not structured my channel around giving specific training advice or instructions to people. When I first launched my channel, I decided that I was going to focus instead on the scientific, objective investigation of physical and mental martial performance, weapon use, and defensive equipment and strategies, rather than on teaching martial arts. There are already a whole bunch of channels, innumerable channels really, that seek to teach people martial arts or self-defense. So I would just really be white noise against that kind of backdrop. Instead, my channel focuses on using the scientific method to shed light on the inner workings of martial arts, self-defense and weapon use, specifically the areas that fascinate and excite me personally. In my opinion, a scientific test showing whether something works, how it works, and how it can be improved is far more valid and actually intrinsically valuable to people than any kind of internet argument about technique. And that's why I typically don't engage in arguments and internet drama about various techniques and various systems and about whether they work or not. As far as I'm concerned, that's just a waste of time. So although I'm fully qualified to issue training advice, and I do so regularly to my actual martial arts students and self-defense students here in Australia, when I discuss training on my channel, I will always talk in terms of very broad training principles, using plenty of examples instead of handing out hard and fast training tips or programs. I believe that this may actually be of more use to folk who train in other systems of martial arts, because broad training principles can be adapted more easily to martial systems that differ fundamentally from my own system of traditional Kung Fu. In this video, I will thus discuss and perhaps demonstrate some very broad training principles that can be applied to any system of combat, martial arts, or self-defense to improve a practitioner's reaction speed, or even for people who aren't necessarily in a martial art or self-defense system, but who would like to train reaction speeds and response times anyway. So that said, let's go on to how to train centralized movement for improved response times and fast reactions. I must mention the difficulties with associated with this kind of training first up. The type of training that I'm going to discuss in this video involves what I typically refer to as internal training. Internal training involves the development of fine levels of awareness and control of many of the practitioner's body's internal processes, organs, spaces, and of subtle concepts such as the center of mass and center of rotation, etc. As you can imagine, developing these faculties takes a lot of consistent effort over a long period of time. There are no quick fixes as far as internal training is concerned. Although the Wushu scientist and I are currently working on enhancing the traditional training methodologies through the use of technological forms of biofeedback. This technology is still a long way off though, so no shortcuts are currently available. As such, awareness and control of concepts like lower Dantian take a long time to develop, because the training process actually involves reprogramming the brain and the body over time, along with establishing new feedback mechanisms that are not actually there to begin with. So please do not be disappointed that you can't learn these things in a short space of time. You have to essentially rewire your body and brain, and that process takes time.
It doesn't go up to 4,200.
Does now, my stout little friend. I rewired it.
So I first want to speak about the overall training structure or stages. There are 5 basic stages of the training process. Although the word stages can be a bit misleading, because these different parts can occur concurrently, and they do occur concurrently at times, and there's a constant cycling back to earlier stages. So at any one time you might be training or working with all 5 of these parts or structures in the training process. It's perhaps better to call them parts of the training structure. These are namely internal, external, uncontested bridging, contested bridging, and refinement. Internal training is purely training or building awareness of lower Dantian or center, and of course the other internal processes in the body. The external training is training more relaxed movement, but which is important. So relaxation in these kinds of exercises and techniques is very important. But what is also really important is refinement and sort of working towards a more efficient posture, so structure throughout the rest of your body. So how your joints are aligned, how your skeletal structure is positioned, where your weight is. So this is more of an external type of training, but it does involve a lot of fine awareness of how your body is positioned. So it's really how you position your body and how you position all your joints, how everything lines up in order to express force and acceleration and other things like that. Then we get on to uncontested bridging. Uncontested bridging is is really a reference to how you align all of the structures in your body. So similar to what the external refinement of posture and structure is about, but it's how all of these structures align in your body to actually achieve an end goal, like for instance exert force in a particular direction. And when we talk about uncontested bridging, we talk about bridging training where I'm not experiencing a lot of resistance to that movement. Contested bridging, on the other hand, is the use of internal concepts and expressing force and other things like that in much harder exercises, and where it is contested, quite often by a partner in contested partner technique training, but also in sparring, where clearly your partner is going to be contesting everything that you're doing, partner or partners, however you're doing your sparring. And it's very difficult to actually transport all of these internal concepts and structures, and also the concept of bridging, into a contested sparring situation. Quite difficult, it's a challenge. And then finally, number 5 is refinement, and that's essentially how you develop these internal concepts over time, developing adaptation of your system through continued practice, that kind of thing. So those 5 structures, internal, external, relaxed or uncontested bridging and contested bridging and refinement, these can be happening, these do happen simultaneously, and there's also a cycling back through all of them as you progress as well. So this same structure, the same training structure that I just explained to you can be applied to many aspects of our training that involve internal concepts, such as potency training, for instance, which I do want to address in a few dedicated videos in the future. Of course, as I've mentioned in other videos, potency training is how to train the body to most efficiently harness your forces in order to generate a much higher force output, or be able to modify or manipulate much higher forces, and other concepts like that. So it's like an enhanced strength training, if you like, specific to combat and specific to internal practitioners. So all of these aspects of our training program involve training internal principles to either create or modify external effects. So in order to explain how this training structure works, we're going to use an example, and in this case I'm going to use a very, very simple example from our system, which is an inner circular block. And our inner circular block looks a little bit like this. It's very, very simple movement, usually practiced, or at least in the beginning, it's practiced from a stance called short horse. And I'll just step back in line with this screen so that you can see where my feet are. You're going to bend your legs slightly, knees slightly bent. This is the structure or the posture that you're going to adopt. And then you're just going to do a very small internal rotation with the hand. So inner circular block. I can change to the other hand, and I can practice the same movement on the other side. So this is your typical inner circular block. Notice that my elbows are quite down. That's part of the structural optimization for that movement. So it would be a simple matter for a martial artist in another system to substitute one or more other simple movements from their own system for this inner circular block example that I've chosen. Before we start to work on this simple movement, we have to start with the underlying internal systems. So the internal training, as I've mentioned before, is part of a long-term training investment and improves the longer that one trains it. It's definitely not something that can be developed quickly. It's also not a type of training that can yield great results if the practitioner tries too hard.
Maximum effort.
In other words, the more stress the practitioner is under, like tense musculature or mental tension or not being focused and relaxed internally, the lower the likelihood that they will be able to develop internal awareness, because the subtle internal sensations that we're trying to become familiar with and trying to become cognizant of will be overwhelmed by sensations of stress and muscular exertion. Essentially, it's like it'll be too noisy for you to actually hear what's happening in your body if you're tense, if you're under pressure. So relax, and you shouldn't try too hard in this kind of training. Quality, consistency, and presence of mind are more important than the concept of hard work as far as this is concerned. This kind of training needs to be performed as consistent, low impact training sessions over a long period of time, years. So here I'm going to give you some examples of methods that you can use, a couple of very simple examples of methods that you can use to train internal awareness and control of Dantian. So I'm going to step back to the screen again so that you can see where my feet are. The stance, as I mentioned before, that we are using is what we call a short horse stance or a short mabu. Feet are about shoulder width apart, knees slightly bent, knees soft. I'll turn to the side, keeping your hips tucked, slightly tucked in underneath you. So you don't want your butt sticking out behind you, and you also don't want to thrust your hips forward. You want to just keep it underneath you. That slight tilt of the hips there is really you're engaging pelvic floor muscles. As I said, knees slightly bent, and keeping your spine elongated, so extending through the spine, keeping the chin in. You're going to close your eyes, you're going to look at the bridge of your nose, You're going to try and keep this sensation of lengthening through the spine. You're just going to allow your arms to just relax relax at your sides. And you're going to look in at the bridge of your nose, and you're going to concentrate on your sensations of weight, your body mass, where it is distributed. You want to try and keep it nice and even on the feet. Try and keep it, keep your weight moving through the tripod of the foot, made with the two sections of the ball of the foot and the heel. So right through the middle, essentially the center of that arch in your foot. And try and keep the weight going through there, and you want to not concentrate too heavily on breathing, but you want to be aware, you want to sort of become aware of sensations of breath in your body. Closing your eyes and looking at the bridge of your nose through your closed eyes is a way of helping to focus your intention internally. It's like mentally focus internally. So this is something that you can do for a few minutes at a time. Just breathing, becoming aware. You can become aware of things like your heart rate, blood flowing through your system, where it is moving, heat, sensations internally, all of that. So it's really becoming building an awareness of the activity within your body, as well as your body weight and how it is positioned and everything like that. So that's a good starting exercise. And as I said, you can do that for a few minutes at a time, depending on how much time you have and how much you're going to be able to concentrate on it, because it is difficult to concentrate on these things for long periods of time, at least in the beginning. From there, we can work into a simple standing Qigong exercise. For this, we're going to, the breath is going to be become a lot more, it's going to be a lot more structured. So we're going to place our hands over lower Dantian, which is just below the navel. Keep your shoulders relaxed and rounded down. And we're going to extend slightly through the system, again keeping the chin in, keeping your spine elongated. Same stance, soft knees. You're going to close your eyes, you're going to look at the bridge of your nose, and you're going to concentrate on sensations of breath. And what you want to do is you want to try and instigate the breath from lower Dantian. So lower Dantian is actually going to be the primary point that's going to be essentially drawing breath in, and then the breath will be able to move out again. Obviously, you're not breathing into this area. What we're really talking about is muscles like the pelvic floor and bounding musculature around the pelvic cavity becoming involved in the breathing process. So we involve all of the structures, in particular we involve this in the breathing process to try to maximize the breathing efficiency, but also to activate these areas, which can then be used to do other things like modify force in the body, that kind of thing. So as I said, close your eyes, looking at the bridge of your nose, and slowly concentrate on the sensation of breath coming in and then going out again, keeping your chin in, elongating the spine, etc. And this you can do again for a few minutes at a time. And when you're first starting off, I wouldn't be extending this kind of training very long, just a few minutes at a time, but consistently. So essentially every day. So the other type of training, as I mentioned, from the internal, we go to the external training, which is another foundation of this bridged internal training, which is making your stance more structurally efficient and optimizing it. There's a lot of work that can be done even in something as simple as a short horse stance. So learning how to sink the weight, learning how to keep the weight even when you're moving your arms and that kind of thing, learning how to engage body movement in the other movements that you're doing, so the peripheral movements potentially in the arms. There's a lot of work that can be done there. That happens over time as well. So for instance, with the inner circular block, you'll notice that when I'm doing the inner circular block, I'm actually not just moving my arm, so I'm not just doing this. I'm actually using the rest of my body. So the rest of my body is actually shifting here. But that's something that can be refined again over time. So what I'm going to do now is just show you another little exercise that you can do. I'm just going to move a little bit further away from the screen, which is an exercise that we call swayao, performed from the same stance. So a short horse stance, hips tucked in slightly, spine elongated, chin in a little bit. And what we're going to do here is we're going to rotate from side to side. We're going to swing our arms. One arm is going to impact on top of the shoulder, the other is going to impact up underneath the rib cage. Important things to note here is that this is a constrained rotation. So I'm not rotating to the point where my structure starts collapsing. You can see what's happening with my leg here, it's becoming buckled. That's exaggerated, but you don't want that. So you don't want your structure to twist too much here. There is a rotation, but you'll notice that I'm keeping my knees pretty much forward. So it's a very constrained rotation that doesn't break the structural integrity of that stance. So I want to work with that rotation, moving that rotation up into my arms. Okay. This is one of the what we call the 6 primary exercises of our system, which are very simple physical movements that help to teach broad movement principles and also engagement of the body and center in movement. There's an old proverb that is used a lot in Tai Chi, which is when one part of the body is still, all of the body is still. When one part is moving, all is moving. So this is an example of that. While I'm doing this movement, all of my body is moving and is engaged and synchronized with the movement in my arms. When I stop, all of my body is still. So what I don't want to do is I don't want to kind of do whiplash kind of movements where I'm actually breaking my structure, I'm breaking the engagement in that movement, or just do the movement, for instance, with my arms, because then there's not much of a benefit in terms of integrating the whole body in a movement. What we can do then, using the swayao movement, is use the same constrained rotation into an inner circular block. So the same inner circular block I introduced earlier, we're going to still use that as the example here, except what we're going to do is we're going to engage that constrained swayao rotation into inner circular block, and we can do it on the other side as well. So you'll notice that as I'm doing that inner circular block, my whole body is actually engaged behind that movement. So I'm not just trying to do the movement with my arm. I can do that slowly, and it's a good idea to practice this really slowly to begin with. Slow movement helps to point out imbalances and inefficiencies, because you'll start to feel muscles that are tense and that need to be relaxed, that kind of thing. And that is actually the premise behind much of what's practiced in Tai Chi. The reason it's done slowly is so that these problems can be pointed out through, as the practitioner is doing the movement very slowly, actually feeling imbalances and feeling inefficiencies and muscle tension. What we can then do is we can associate that inner circular block movement with center. And this is where it turns into a bridging exercise. So instead of it just being a large-scale peripheral body movement, I'm actually going to initiate the movement from Dantian. So the same kind of rotations, except that it's actually Dantian or lower Dantian or center. That actually, you want to try and get the feeling that is actually initiating that rotation that is then being expressed in the hands. So again, that's a long-term training investment. So if I describe bridging really simply, simply put, it is intelligent joint, limb and muscle control, which allows the practitioner to safely and effectively express force or energy through the body as controlled and modified and directed by lower Dantian, or center. So it's how to align the body while you're busy doing something. So for instance, if I take a silly example, a simple silly example of a circular punch to the side, for instance. If I drop my elbow for this punch, can you see that that structure is a lot less efficient at carrying the type of force vectors that I'm generating up through the body if I'm using a rotation, which is why the elbow actually has to be slightly raised for a circular punch. It's to more efficiently carry the force vectors that I'm creating through the body. So that's an example, a simple and perhaps a little bit of a silly example of bridging. How to intelligently control your joints and all the systems in the body to most effectively and efficiently convey an end result, like a force or impact or whatever you're trying to do. So we use these bridging exercises like Swayao and the few others that I've described already as simple bridges themselves. So you could describe them as bridges themselves between the internal and the external parts of your body. Exercises that take the sensation of center and try to express it in movement, such as the Swayao exercise that we were doing earlier. So it's important, once you start to learn how to feel, become aware of center, and how to actually bridge it out, to be used, typically it's trained traditionally by incorporating it more and more into forms training, repetitive movement, shadow boxing routines like sparring and uncontested partner technique training. What you want to try and do, as I've mentioned before, is to remove sensations of peripheral muscle tension through the system in terms of movement and force manipulation. It's almost the opposite, you could say, of bodybuilding in some regards, in which the bodybuilding practitioner seeks to concentrate awareness and effort into their peripheral muscle groups. So let's say like a bicep, for instance, if they're training biceps, to maximize the potential for that muscle growth. So we are actually trying to do the opposite. We're actually trying to remove sensations of effort from the body and try and localize that whole effort through center rather than in the peripheral parts of our body. Once we start to work with incorporating Dantian into the softer or uncontested bridging, we can then start incorporating it into harder and harder types of training, like physical potency training. You could potentially incorporate it into conventional strength training, but also in contested partner technique training and contested sparring, so typical sparring engagement. When we're practicing relaxed bridging, it's important to feel that movement originates from lower Dantian, so from center. And when you're doing these inner circular blocks, using this example that we've been using, you should try and make the movements fluid and soft, as if it is moving, as if you're moving underwater, essentially, that kind of sensation. So I can do these movements without a partner, without any kind of resistance to the movement, but I can also then engage a partner, so I can actually do these movements with a partner as well, to try with the partner actually not contesting too much, so only providing very little resistance to the movement, but giving you a lot of feedback on what they're feeling inside as you're doing the movement, while you work to minimize the sensations of peripheral muscle exertion as you're busy doing that movement. So I might just call the Wushu scientist quickly, just to give me a bit of assistance here. We can actually do this in front of the screen. So just using the inner circular block example, what the Wushu scientist is going to do is she's just going to resist that movement. So this is now becoming it's an uncontested, but what the Wushu scientist is going to do is give me some feedback and not resist the movement too much. So what I need to do is to try to maximize my engagement from center without exerting any kind of peripheral musculature in that movement. So I want to really try and remove those sensations as far as possible. I don't want to feel like my joints are stiffening up, like my muscles are being worked or anything like that. Okay, so, and this is something that you can do very gently, and your partner can give you some feedback on what they're feeling.
I'm feeling that in my shoulders, and yeah, good. I can feel that going down to center.
So that's the goal there. So just get a little bit of feedback going in that exercise. I can also up the difficulty on the exercise by getting my partner to do this as more of a contested bridging exercise as well. So in this case, the Wushu scientist is going to resist my movement, and I'm going to have to try and overcome that resistance through her structure. And that becomes really hard because the temptation is to try to tense up and force a result. And that's what you want to try and avoid. You want to try and avoid forcing the result and rather work on minimizing your own muscular exertion and trying to get the movement to stem from center. So in this case, I'm just going to, I want to really try and avoid any kind of tension in my system, and just slowly see if I can't shift my partner, even though they're resisting. It's very difficult, it's not easy, but again, don't concentrate necessarily on end results at the cost of developing these more subtle internal principles. Thanks. As another example of a simple contested or hard training example, this is why I have this screen here. It's just a handy surface that I can use to demonstrate this. Is I can do an exercise that we sometimes call pushing mountains, and it's done with various movements. It's not just this. This is just one movement that I might practice as a pushing mountains exercise. I can make contact with the surface here. You could use a wall, or you could use a pillar, or even a heavy bag if you like. It doesn't really matter, as long as when you make this contact, you're going to try and exert force, and of course the object is typically not going to move. But what you want to do is you want to try and avoid, you want to move through, be very conscious in your system of imbalances and tension, and you want to try and remove those sensations of tension and just work with engaging center in that movement. So that's an example of another hard or contested bridging exercise to try to express the internal control externally. And again, that's going to take a lot of time. Once you start working with these sort of training principles again, and you start to get a sense or awareness of center, you can start to strengthen that brain Dantian connection through repetition and repetitive use in day-to-day life. So perhaps when you're opening doors, for instance, as a silly example, perhaps start to engage using center instead. Try to eliminate, again, sensations of peripheral muscle exertion or tension. So these are ways that you can work it into your day-to-day life to essentially get more training out of your day at no extra training cost to you. And what we talk about is what Master Chan used to talk about with sensation or awareness of center, is that it starts off as a very nebulous kind of sensation in the pelvic area. And over time it needs to be trained and refined until the sense becomes a single point in the center of that pelvic area, the lower Dantian location. And that is actually it's actually a description of how the brain refines its new connection with this area, because this is of course a whole area associated with various organs and muscle groups, and what you're trying to do is map that as essentially like a new virtual organ in the body as the lower Dantian. And we can talk here a little bit about neuroplasticity. This is an example of neuroplasticity. So if you look at Wikipedia, for example, it gives a very brief and concise description of what neuroplasticity is. It's also known as neuroplasticity or brain plasticity. Is the ability of the neural networks in the brain to change through growth and reorganization. These changes range from individual neuron pathways making new connections to systematic adjustments like cortical remapping. Now, in our case, we're actually consciously trying to engage that neuroplasticity to reprogram how the brain and body works, and to engage these new areas, lower Dantian, in particular in this case. And of course, this set of examples and exercises that I discussed today and demonstrated little bits of, these are just really an example to kind of get you going on the path, on the process. And this can be, as I've mentioned many times, needs to be refined over a long period of time. And then it can actually become something that helps you to improve things like reaction times. There are many other things that you can improve with it as well. As I mentioned, it's a similar kind of training structure that we adopt when we are practicing potency training as well. Well, I hope this was of some benefit to you. If there are any questions, or if you want me to elaborate more on some of these training principles and concepts, just let me know in the comments section below. Otherwise, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you all again next time. Cheers.